Hey guys, this is Post-Production Pi, and welcome to Part 7 of the Professional Photoshop Portrait Retouching series on srlounge.com. Now, in this tutorial, we're going to teach you guys basically how to retouch eyes. We're going to cover everything regarding eyes. Before we get to that, in the last tutorial we covered how to create a skin softening layer when absolutely necessary. I did forget to label that as Part 6, so go ahead and change the name of that in your Layers palette to Part 6, Skin Softener, if you haven't already done so. Let's get started in this tutorial. We're going to start by hitting Alt Control Shift E to jump every single, to merge every single previous layer into a new layer. We're going to label this Part 7, and we'll call it the eyes. Alright, now let's get started. We're going to zoom into our eyes, and let's talk a little about what needs to be done. So I'm going to go back to 250%. Now, in eyes, the first thing that we need to do is well, there's a bunch of things that we need to do actually. We need to reduce the appearance of redness. We need to reduce any veins and lines that we see. We also need to brighten them up and enhance the colors. So we're going to do each of these with a different step using different adjustment layers and so on. So let's get started with the whites of the eyes, or the sclera. Alright, so let's zoom into our image and let's start from the top. Well, the first thing I notice right now is that basically I have a nice catch line on the left side, but it looks a little too diminished on the right side. So let's amplify the right side, and I think the easiest way to do that is just to copy this catch line over and make a few adjustments. So with the lasso tool selected, I'm just going to copy this little catch light right here. Just go around the eye and try and get it as close as possible. I made a little mistake right there, but that's fine. We're going to jump this to a new layer. We're going to call this catch light. The reason why I pull it on a new layer rather than just copy on the same layer is because we want to be able to make adjustments to it. Now I'm going to move this to the right side of the eye, kind of lining it up, and then I'm going to make a few adjustments. Let's kind of shrink it. I'm going to bend it into place just a little bit. Whoops. I'm going to rotate it by hitting Control T so I can bring up my bounding box. And let's shrink it a little bit because I want it to be a little bit diminished on this right side. I don't want it to be identical to what it looks like on the left. I'm going to hit enter to see how that looks. I think that looks about fine right there. If I need to make a couple minor movements, I'm going to just use the up and down arrows to move it by a few pixels. Let's zoom out and see what it looks like. If I need to, I can adjust that opacity of that layer down a little bit just so it doesn't look identical to the one that's on the left. But it does do a nice job of kind of amplifying it. You can see by unclicking it, it does a nice job of amplifying the one on the right without making it look identical. Alright, and if we want, we can shrink it down again by hitting Control T just again to shrink it down just a tiny bit more. That looks fine where it's at. Let's go on to the next step. Now the next thing I want to do is basically brighten up the whites of the eyes. I want to brighten up the scleras to kind of just make it a little more punchy. Now, when you're brightening up the sclera, one thing you want to be aware of is you don't want to brighten the entire eye evenly. And you don't want to necessarily brighten the left eye and the right eye to the same amount, because depending on where the light source is, one eye is always going to be darker or brighter than the other. So let's get started. There's a couple other things we want to make adjustments to in the sclera. I'll talk about them as we're going through. I'm going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer, and we're going to hit, let's actually do this. Let's put this, let's actually merge the catch light and the eyes onto one layer. We're just going to select both of those and hit merge layers, and that's fine. We can call this, rename this to Part 7 again, the eyes. And what I want to do is just make the hue saturation layer only apply to the eye layer in case we have other layers below it in your guys' jobs that you don't want affected. So again, Alt Control G or Option Command G on a Mac will apply it just a layer below it. And now we're going to make it just a couple quick adjustments. So one thing I want to do is with the whites of the eyes, with the sclera, a lot of times you'll notice that, especially in close-up eye shots, that there's a lot of veiny detail there. That's normal, depending on how much sleep a person's had or whether or not they do drugs or something like that. It's going to actually affect the appearance of those veins. If you see a lot of veins, then you're going to have to probably clone or heal them out. We don't see a lot of veins in this situation, but we do see a little bit of redness. With redness, we can remove just basically by pulling out the saturation. So I'm going to reduce saturation to, like, say -20, and then I want to also brighten up the highlights of that sclera a little bit. So I'm going to brighten up just by taking lightness up to, let's say, 10. Now what we're going to do with this mask selected, we're going to hit Control I to invert the mask so it's not applying to any other area. We're going to hit brush to, or B to choose our brush tool. I'm going to hit X to select white as my foreground color and zoom in just a little bit more, and I'm going to paint over the area of the sclera that I want brightened. Now what I'm doing is I'm painting over the highlight area of the sclera, and I'm not adjusting the shadowy area. Why? Because I don't necessarily want that shadowy area to be brightened. If you're going to brighten the entire eye, then it's going to look a little bit fake. What I'm doing right now is I'm going to adjust my hardness down to 0 because I notice an edge right here. Let me do that again. I want it to be a very soft look. And then what I'm going to do once I have that painted in is I'm just going to hit X, and we're going to paint it out of the iris and the pupil. So we're not adjusting that at all. I'm going to paint it out of the corner of the eye because I don't want to brighten that. And I'm going to paint it out of the eyelid below. And that's fine. Again, I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Now, if you don't want to adjust each eye the same way, then you want to create 2 different adjustment layers or adjust the opacity of your brush so you're not affecting both eyes the exact same way. But I'm going to be kind of lazy in this just to save time, and we're just going to do both the exact same. Again, I'm hitting X again to select black and mask back out my pupil. I'm going to also clean up the edge of the eye, the eyelid, and the corner. That looks fine. I'm going to zoom out just to see how it looks. Now from here, basically with eyes, you want to make sure that these adjustments are subtle. If they're too powerful, they're going to look kind of crazy. So if I adjust my lightness up or down, we can kind of see what's too powerful. Now over here, that's way too strong. Down here, we don't really notice anything. I think about at where it was, around 8 to 10 is about where I want it. And that's fine. We can also tweak our saturation if we need to. I think around where we had it is about fine. So about -20 is good. Alright. So that looks good where it's at. Let's now work on the iris and kind of the colors of the iris. Now, I actually learned this retouching trick from Sean Armenta. He's one of the FStoppers. And so got to give credit where credit's due. I was using a different way to adjust the irises, and then, frankly, I like his way better. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a curves layer. And we'll call this iris adjustment. Again, I want this to affect only the layer below, so we're going to hit Alt-Control-G. It's going to apply only to the eyes. Now what we're going to do first is select that mask again. We're going to hit Control-I to invert it. The other way to add an adjustment layer with an inverted mask already is simply to hold Alt while you're adding the adjustment layer, or hold Option on a Mac. So let's quickly paint in the area that we actually want to be affected. So I want the iris to be affected. Let's just paint that in right now. To be able to see our adjustment, let's just turn on the masking layer so we can actually see it by hitting \. I'm going to not affect the eyelash and just make sure that we're not affecting any of the sclera. Same thing on this eye. That looks fine right there. We can make minor adjustments if we need to after we apply the effect. So let me kind of add the effect and we'll see if we need. So I'm going to hit \ again. Now here's what we're going to do. With this little dragging adjustment tool selected, we're going to go out to the iris and go out to the brightest spot, and we're going to click and drag up to pull the brightest spot up. Next, we're going to click on a shadow and we're going to pull that down to drag it down. And what we're doing is we're creating a nice little S-curve that's pumping up the contrast of the iris. It's really enhancing the color. We can make modifications to that S-curve by just further adjusting it over here, pulling down the highlights if we need to. And you can even go basically to, if the effect is too strong, we zoom out and we say, okay, that's too much of an effect, we can, or too strong an effect, we can adjust the opacity down as desired. So again, with eyes, you want to be kind of err on the side of subtlety because you don't want it to be too crazy. The eyes will look kind of gnarly and maybe a little animal-like or whatever. So I think around 80% with that effect is nice. The colors look great. Now there's one other technique that Sean shows to further enhance the iris of the eyes. You guys can use this in addition to what we just learned, or you guys can use this on its own combination, whatever you guys kind of pick. But here's how it works. So you're going to add another curves layer. We're going to once again hit Alt-Control-G to make sure this applies only to the layer below it. We're going to also change the blend mode on this to linear dodge. Now what this is going to do is create a kind of a crazy funky brightening effect, but that's fine. What we're going to do is once again invert that mask, and now we have a black mask. We're going to zoom into our image, zoom in by holding Alt and scrolling in, and what we're basically going to do is with a brush selected and with a kind of brush at a medium hardness and full opacity and a small size, we're going to basically create these brush strokes coming out from the pupil in the iris. Okay, so you kind of want to follow the direction of the iris. shrink the brush down and then kind of enhance it or enlarge the size again to kind of create a randomness in the sizing. Okay, do the same thing on this eye over on the right side. Again, we're kind of following with the highlights of the eye, so we're not painting in necessarily the really dark areas of the shadows. Following the direction of the eye. Looks a little bit crazy right now, but that's cool. What we're going to do now is we're going to select, with that mask selected, we're going to go up to filter, to blur, and we're going to do a Gaussian blur on this. We don't need it nearly as high. We're going to kind of lower this to maybe around 3 pixels. We're going to hit OK, and then from here you're just going to adjust the opacity. So we can pull it down, but what this layer is going to do is it's just going to further kind of enhance those streaks and those strands in the iris. Now, whether you think it looks kind of crazy, whether you like the look, it's up to you. I would definitely be careful with not going overboard with this because it can look kind of gnarly, but it has a nice, just kind of subtle effect if you keep it really low in opacity. I'm going to keep it at 20%. So, let's check out those eye adjustments. What I'm going to do right now is let's group these eye adjustments into a new layer just so we can kind of keep this cleaned up. I'm going to hit Shift and then click on the Part 7, the eyes. We're going to go down to, actually just a quick way of doing this is just to hit Control G. It's going to automatically group it. We're going to call this Part 7, the eyes. And let's click on the visibility icon to see what we have before and what we have after. We can zoom out again to see if the effect is too strong or too subtle. If you guys like it the way it's at, then leave it there. If you guys feel like it's too strong, you can adjust the opacity of everything down, or you can affect individual layers just by opening it up and adjusting it. Let's also, just to clean this up a little bit, let's also select these 2 layers. We're going to group these into skin softener. This is Part 6, skin softening, just to keep our layers palette a little bit more clean. Alright guys, so great job. The next tutorial is going to cover cleaning up all of the details in our image. So all these stray strands of hair, crosshairs, everything like that we want to kind of clean up.